At White Feather's Arisaka. The humid Philippine dawn of March 15, 1944, found Marine Corporal James White Feather Morrison crouched in the abandoned Japanese bunker, his calloused fingers wrapped around the most unlikely weapon in his arsenal, a captured Arisaka Type 38 rifle. The scent of rotting vegetation and cordite hung thick in the tropical air, mixing with the distant smell of rice cooking in some hidden enemy camp. Morrison had been awake for 18 hours, his squad sleeping fitfully around him, but his mind wouldn't quiet. 3 weeks had passed since he'd stripped this rifle from a dead Japanese sniper during the bloody fighting on Leyte. The memory still burned. A young soldier, maybe 19, clutching a photograph of an elderly woman, his mother, grandmother. Morrison couldn't tell. The boy had been so carefully positioned, so patient in his final moments, that Morrison had almost respected him. Almost. "That antique's gonna get you killed, Morrison," Sergeant Baker had sneered just hours before their current patrol began. The sergeant's voice carried the authority of a man who'd survived Guadalcanal and expected unquestioning obedience. "Stick to American steel." Morrison had nodded respectfully, but his fingers never left the worn wooden stock of the Type 38. While his fellow Marines saw only an outdated bolt-action rifle, Morrison recognized something his squadmates didn't. Sometimes survival demanded becoming invisible, and nothing made you invisible like using the enemy's own tools against them. The Arisaka wasn't just any captured rifle. It was a 1905 vintage weapon that told stories in its scratches and wear patterns. Morrison had studied it obsessively during quiet moments, learning its balance, its particular quirks. The Type 38's distinctive crack was burned into every American ear as the sound of incoming enemy fire. More importantly, its 6.5mm cartridge produced a sharper, higher-pitched report that could easily be mistaken for distant Japanese positions. He'd been developing what he privately called his silent route, a method of acoustic deception that could save American lives, but explaining that to his superiors would be impossible. In their world, using enemy equipment was tantamount to collaboration, no matter how many Marines it might save. The patrol's mission seemed straightforward enough: guide a squad of 12 Marines through 2 miles of Japanese-held jungle to extract a downed Navy pilot. Intelligence suggested light enemy presence, scattered resistance at most. But Morrison's instincts, honed by 6 months of Pacific combat, screamed otherwise. As point man, he'd already spotted signs the briefing officers had missed. Freshly cut vegetation arranged too precisely, disturbed earth patterns that suggested prepared positions, the telltale glint of concealed metal. The Japanese weren't just present in these hills, they were waiting. Morrison shifted the Arisaka's position, feeling its familiar weight against his shoulder. In 3 hours, when his squad began their approach to the crash site, everything would depend on his ability to think like the enemy. The irony wasn't lost on him. To save American lives, he might have to become something his own countrymen would consider treasonous. If stories like this make you question what you'd do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this situation. And stay with us for the next chapters. How far would you go to save your brothers, even if it meant crossing lines your own army forbade? At 06:30 hours, Morrison's unconventional strategy began when he spotted the first enemy checkpoint through the dense Philippine undergrowth. 4 Japanese soldiers manned a carefully camouflaged position overlooking the only viable approach route to the crash site. The setup was textbook perfect: interlocking fields of fire, natural concealment, commanding view of the terrain. Any conventional assault would alert every enemy position within a mile radius. Morrison made a decision that would have court-martialed him if witnessed by his superiors. Rather than signal his squad for a coordinated attack, he chambered around in the captured Arisaka and did something that violated every rule of engagement he'd ever learned. He fired 3 deliberate shots, not at the enemy, but into the trees 60 yards to their left, perfectly mimicking the sound signature of a Japanese patrol engaging unseen American targets. The psychological effect was immediate and devastating. The checkpoint guards, hearing what sounded unmistakably like their own weapons firing at American forces in a completely different direction, abandoned their carefully prepared position to investigate and provide support. Morrison watched through his field glasses as they moved with disciplined urgency toward the phantom firefight, leaving their post empty and undefended. Private Rodriguez, crouched beside Morrison, stared in confusion as their squad slipped through the gap in complete silence. "What the hell just happened, Corporal?" "Keep moving and keep quiet," Morrison whispered, already planning his next deception. But this was only the beginning of a pattern that would repeat 7 more times over the next 4 hours. Morrison had discovered something that no military manual had ever taught. The enemy's greatest weakness wasn't their equipment or training, but their inability to distinguish their own weapons from captured ones used against them. Behind Japanese lines, Captain Ishikawa was experiencing his own confusion. Reports were flooding in from multiple positions, American forces engaging scattered patrols across a wide front. But something felt wrong about the pattern. The attacks were too brief, too perfectly timed, yet the weapon signatures were unmistakably Japanese, suggesting either captured equipment or coordinated deception beyond American capabilities. "Send reinforcements to sectors 4 and 7. Ishikawa ordered his communication sergeant, but maintained defensive positions elsewhere. Something is not as it appears. Morrison, meanwhile, was proving that assumption catastrophically wrong. At each subsequent obstacle, machine gun nests, sniper positions, patrol routes, he employed variations of the same lethal deception. The Arisaka's authentic sound signature allowed him to create false firefights, phantom contacts, and imaginary American positions that drew Japanese forces away from his squad's actual route. He would fire the captured rifle from concealed positions, then quickly switch to his M1 Garand for any genuine engagements, creating the illusion of multiple separate contacts across an impossibly wide front. His squad moved like ghosts through terrain that should have been impenetrable, following routes that appeared suicidal but proved miraculously clear. Private Chen, the squad's radioman, had started watching Morrison with something approaching awe. "Corporal, how did you know they'd abandon that position?" Morrison checked the Arisaka's chamber before answering. "Because they're soldiers, same as us. They hear their own weapons firing. They assume it's their people in trouble." What Morrison didn't say was how much this strategy was costing him internally. Every shot fired from that Japanese rifle felt like a small betrayal, a step away from everything he'd been taught about honor and proper conduct. But watching his Marines move safely through terrain that should have killed half of them made the moral compromise bearable. For now. How do you maintain your identity when survival demands you become something else entirely? The most crucial test came at 1100 hours, when Morrison's patrol encountered a reinforced Japanese position directly blocking their path to the downed Navy pilot. 15 enemy soldiers had established interlocking fields of fire in a natural choke point, a narrow ravine that offered the only viable approach to the crash site. The position was perfectly sited, professionally constructed, and absolutely impregnable to frontal assault. Sergeant Baker crawled up beside Morrison, studying the obstacle through his binoculars. The morning heat was already building, typical of the Philippine climate that had claimed as many American lives as enemy bullets. "We'll have to call for artillery support," Baker whispered. "No way through that position without losing half the squad." Morrison studied the enemy setup, his mind racing through possibilities. Artillery would take hours to coordinate and would certainly kill the Navy pilot they were supposed to rescue. But conventional tactics offered no alternative, except the one that was becoming increasingly clear to him. "Give me 10 minutes, Sergeant. I might have another option." "Morrison, whatever you're thinking, don't—" But Morrison was already moving, the Arisaka cradled in his arms like a familiar tool. What he did next was audacious beyond military comprehension. He used the captured rifle to simulate a Japanese patrol retreating under heavy American fire, firing in a carefully orchestrated pattern that suggested friendly forces falling back while under pursuit. The ruse worked perfectly. The Japanese position commander, hearing what sounded like a desperate fighting withdrawal by his own troops, ordered his men to advance and provide covering fire for what they believed were retreating comrades. The impregnable defensive position emptied as 15 soldiers rushed forward to support their phantom allies. Morrison's squadmates, hidden and ready, waited until the Japanese soldiers were completely exposed before engaging. The firefight was brief, decisive, and far less costly than any conventional assault could have been. Private Williams, reloading his rifle, shook his head in disbelief. "Corporal, that was either brilliant or crazy. Maybe both." From the enemy perspective, Captain Ishikawa was beginning to understand the true scope of what he faced. Radio reports had been contradictory all morning. Massive American forces advancing across multiple fronts, yet no sustained contact, no clear battle lines. Now his strongest defensive position had been abandoned to pursue retreating forces that apparently didn't exist. "These Americans are using captured weapons," he told his aide. "Someone among them understands psychological warfare better than our own intelligence estimates suggested." Morrison, meanwhile, was wrestling with his own psychological warfare, the internal battle between duty and innovation. Every successful deception brought them closer to the pilot, but also deeper into moral territory that military doctrine had never prepared him to navigate. As they approached the crash site, Morrison caught sight of something that stopped him cold. Scattered around the downed aircraft were personal items, photographs, letters, a small wooden flute, evidence of human lives, enemy lives, but unmistakably human nonetheless. He picked up one photograph, a Japanese family gathered around a dinner table, smiling at the camera. For a moment, the face of the sniper he'd killed 3 weeks earlier seemed to merge with those in the picture. They could have been brothers, father and son, uncle and nephew. "Corporal, we found the pilot," Rodriguez called out. "He's alive but injured." Morrison pocketed the photograph before anyone could see it, but the image would stay with him forever. The Arisaka in his hands suddenly felt heavier, not with the weight of steel and wood, but with the accumulated weight of every life it had touched, both the ones it had taken and the ones it had saved. "Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home? Or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. What happens when the tools of war force you to see your enemy as painfully, irreducibly human? With the Navy pilot secured, Lieutenant Commander Robert Hayes, unconscious but stable with a broken leg and multiple lacerations, Morrison's patrol faced the nightmare scenario every Marine in the Pacific Theater dreaded, a running firefight through enemy territory with wounded to protect. The extraction phase should have been straightforward, but radio intercepts suggested that Captain Ishikawa had finally understood the nature of the deception being used against him. Morrison realized that conventional tactics would result in casualties his squad couldn't afford. Hayes needed immediate medical attention, and carrying a stretcher through hostile jungle while under pursuit would be suicidal. But the true genius of Morrison's silent route was about to reveal itself in ways that would later cause intelligence analysts to coin the term acoustic misdirection warfare. As Japanese search parties converged on their position, Morrison began using the Arisaka to create what appeared to be a much larger American unit, moving in entirely different directions. He would fire brief bursts from concealed positions, creating the sound signature of a company strength force conducting a fighting withdrawal toward multiple extraction points. Dr. Yamamoto, the Japanese field medic who had been treating wounded soldiers all morning, paused when he heard the distant rifle fire. Something about the spacing and timing reminded him of hunting with his father before the war. The patient, methodical shots of someone who understood the psychological impact of sound across terrain. "Those are not panic shots," he murmured to his assistant. "Someone is conducting orchestra, not battle." Morrison was indeed conducting an orchestra of deception, but the performance was taking its toll. Each shot fired from the Japanese rifle required him to think like the enemy, to understand their tactical doctrine, their emotional responses, their fundamental humanity. The captured photograph in his pocket seemed to burn against his chest, a constant reminder that every Japanese soldier he deceived had a family, dreams, fears identical to his own. Private Chen, monitoring radio traffic, reported increasing confusion in enemy communications. "Corporal, they think we're a whole battalion. They're requesting reinforcements from 3 different sectors. The deception was working too well. Morrison's fake company was drawing Japanese forces away from their actual position, but it was also escalating the entire situation beyond anyone's control. Soon, real battalions would be involved, real artillery, real air support, and real casualties on a scale that made Morrison's individual moral compromise seem almost trivial. As they moved through the Philippine jungle, carefully carrying Lieutenant Commander Hayes on an improvised stretcher, Morrison caught glimpses of the enemy they were fleeing. Young soldiers, many appearing no older than 18 or 19, responding to orders with the same dedication that motivated his own Marines. They weren't the faceless monsters of propaganda posters, but scared kids doing their duty just as he was doing his. Sergeant Baker, who had initially opposed Morrison's unconventional methods, was beginning to understand their effectiveness. "Morrison, I don't know how you figured this out, but you're keeping us all alive." But Morrison wasn't sure that keeping them alive justified what he was becoming. The Arisaka had transformed him into something his training had never prepared him for. A Marine who could think like the enemy so completely that the distinction between us and them was becoming dangerously blurred. At 1400 hours, they reached the extraction point, a small clearing where a Navy PBY flying boat could land on a nearby river. But Captain Ishikawa's forces were closing in, and Morrison realized he would need one final deception, one last performance with the captured rifle that would either save them all or expose his entire strategy. As he chambered around in the Arisaka, Morrison thought about the photograph in his pocket and wondered if the Japanese sniper he'd killed would approve of how his rifle was being used. Probably not. But then again, probably the sniper would understand, soldier to soldier, that survival sometimes required impossible choices. The weight of those choices was becoming almost unbearable. How many compromises can a person make in the name of survival before they lose track of who they used to be? Morrison's final deception at the extraction point required every lesson he'd learned about enemy psychology during their 4-hour odyssey through Japanese-held territory. As Captain Ishikawa's forces converged on the river landing site, Morrison realized that simple audio misdirection would no longer suffice. The enemy commander had grown too sophisticated, too aware of the patterns being used against him. What happened next would reveal the true secret of Morrison's silent route, a secret so profound that it would challenge everything the Marine Corps believed about warfare, honor, and the nature of the enemy they faced. Morrison began firing the Arisaka in a complex pattern that told a complete story. American forces had successfully extracted their pilot, but were now retreating under heavy pressure, fighting delaying actions at multiple points while calling for emergency air support. But this wasn't just acoustic deception, it was psychological warfare that required Morrison to understand his enemy so completely that he could predict their every tactical response. Captain Ishikawa, listening to the firing patterns from his command post, felt a chill of recognition. The American who was using captured weapons wasn't just creating noise, He was conducting a conversation in the language of tactics, speaking fluent Japanese military doctrine better than some of Ishikawa's own officers. "This American has studied us," Ishikawa told his aide. "He knows our training, our responses, our fears. He is fighting us with our own minds." The secret Morrison had discovered was that warfare at its deepest level wasn't about superior firepower or overwhelming force, but about understanding your enemy so completely that you could predict their every move. The captured Arisaka had become more than a weapon. It was a key that unlocked the psychological landscape of Japanese military thinking. But that understanding came with a terrible price. As Morrison fired the final shots of his deception, watching Japanese forces deploy exactly as he had predicted, he realized that he had achieved something no American soldier was supposed to achieve: perfect empathy with the enemy. He could think like them, feel like them, predict their responses like them, because at some fundamental level they were exactly like him. Dr. Yamamoto, treating wounded soldiers in a field aid station, observed the American deception with something approaching professional admiration. "Whoever is doing this understands that we are soldiers first, Japanese second. He is using our training against us because he recognizes that we are professionals, not monsters." The Navy PBY flying boat landed successfully on the river, its engines providing cover for the squad's final approach. Lieutenant Commander Hayes was loaded aboard, still unconscious but stable. But as Morrison prepared to board the aircraft himself, he made a discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his life. In the dead Japanese sniper's rifle, he found a small piece of paper wrapped around the bolt, a letter written in careful English, obviously composed before the sniper's final mission. Morrison's hands shook as he read the words. "To the American who finds this rifle, please know that I was a teacher before this war. I pray this weapon serves you better than it served me. We are not so different, you and I. May we both find our way home." Morrison stared at the letter, understanding finally that the Japanese sniper had known he was going to die, had known the rifle would be captured, had deliberately left a message for whoever found it. The sniper had been conducting his own psychological operation, reaching across the divide of war to touch the humanity of his enemy. The Arisaka had never been just a captured weapon. It had been a bridge, a means of communication between soldiers who recognized in each other the same dedication, the same fear, the same desperate hope for survival and return home. As the PBY lifted off from the Philippine River, Morrison clutched the letter and realized that his silent route had taught him something the Marine Corps would never want to acknowledge. The enemy was just like them, and that truth was more dangerous than any weapon. What do you do with a truth that could save lives but destroy everything you were taught to believe? The patrol's successful return at 1847 hours marked more than just a tactical victory. It represented a fundamental shift in small unit thinking that the Marine Corps was unprepared to acknowledge. Morrison had saved 12 American lives and completed an impossible mission using nothing more than captured equipment and psychological manipulation. Lieutenant Commander Hayes would recover fully, return to his wife and young daughter in San Diego, and never know that his rescue had cost one Marine his faith in everything he'd been taught about war. Yet when Morrison attempted to explain his methods to the debriefing officers, their response was immediate and dismissive. Major Collins, a career officer who had never seen combat but understood regulations perfectly, listened to Morrison's account with growing disapproval. "Corporal Morrison, the use of captured enemy weapons for deception purposes violates standing orders regarding proper equipment protocols. Your methods, while effective, cannot be officially recognized or recommended for wider application." The after-action report that Morrison was required to submit disappeared into files marked "classified under operational security protocols" and omitted from official records. His innovations, which could have saved hundreds of American lives in similar situations, were buried because they challenged fundamental assumptions about how warfare should be conducted. Morrison never spoke of the Japanese sniper's letter to anyone. It remained hidden in his personal effects, a secret too dangerous to share with men who needed to maintain clear distinctions between friend and enemy. But the letter had changed him in ways that would affect the rest of his life. Sergeant Baker, filing his own report, struggled with how to describe Morrison's actions. The corporal displayed initiative and tactical innovation that saved American lives. His methods were unconventional but effective. I recommend him for commendation. But Baker's recommendation was also buried, lost in the bureaucratic machinery that preferred simple heroism to complex moral questions. The Marine Corps needed heroes who killed enemies, not soldiers who understood them too well. In a Japanese military hospital, Captain Ishikawa was also writing reports. His analysis of the American psychological operations would eventually reach Tokyo, where staff officers would file it away as an isolated incident rather than acknowledge that individual American soldiers had begun to understand Japanese tactics at a dangerous level. Dr. Yamamoto, treating wounded Japanese soldiers, sometimes wondered about the American who had outthought them all. Whoever he was, the doctor told his patients, he fought us with respect. That is something to remember when this war ends. Morrison survived the war, but he never spoke publicly about his innovations. The Arisaka Type 38 that had saved his patrol disappeared into a private collection after VJ Day, its significance unknown to subsequent owners. Morrison sold it to a collector in California who wanted a Japanese war trophy and never asked about its history. Only recently, declassified documents revealed the full scope of what one Marine's willingness to think beyond conventional wisdom had accomplished in 4 crucial hours of forgotten warfare. Military historians, studying the suppressed after-action reports decades later, realized that Morrison had independently solved tactical problems that plagued American forces throughout the entire Pacific campaign. Hundreds of similar patrol missions had failed with heavy casualties because commanders refused to consider unconventional solutions that challenged established doctrine about proper equipment and engagement protocols. Morrison's silent route could have been taught to every Marine unit in the Pacific, but instead it died with him, another casualty of institutional thinking that valued conformity over innovation. Morrison returned to his family farm in Nebraska, married his high school sweetheart, and raised 3 children who never learned their father had been a war hero. He kept the Japanese sniper's letter until his death in 1987, reading it occasionally when the weight of memory became too heavy to bear alone. His youngest son, cleaning out the farmhouse after the funeral, found the letter and the original after-action reports Morrison had kept in a shoebox. Reading them, he finally understood why his father had always insisted that war was more complicated than the movies suggested. The story of Whitefeather's Arisaka illuminates warfare's most persistent paradox. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from superior firepower or overwhelming force, but from the courage to embrace tools and methods that doctrine deems unacceptable, even when lives hang in the balance. More troubling still, sometimes the most effective warriors are those who understand their enemies well enough to recognize their shared humanity, a recognition that makes the continuation of war almost unbearable. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. What truths are we still carrying in silence, waiting for the courage to speak them aloud?